struggle of Indian for the independence. For independence. This chapter, it will be as asked in today's class test. Today's class test. In this chapter, we will emphasize over the such efforts made by Indians in relation to the freedom of a country. In the 19th century, a common feeling of belonging to a particular nation began to develop among people throughout the country. In this scenario, a large number of social activists, patriotics, they sacrifice themselves for freedom of nation, freedom of our country, that freedom which was as a finally as achieved by the Indians in 15th August 1947, when Britishers left our country and India became as the independent nation. In this time period, when the Britishers ruled over a country, under such circumstances, as the social, political, religious, and economic life of the people, it was as completely changed. According to some of the historians and the political scientists, they thought that the nationalism, the idea of a nationalism means a community socially constructed, imagined by the people who perceive themselves as part of that group. This perception of oneness shared by a population and its desire to exist independently is often referred to as the nationalism. In 19th century, due to as the growth of nationalism was a reaction to the British colonialism and its various policies, which basically as work for the exploitation of Indians and their resources. In previous chapters, we discussed that those British policies, how they adversely impact over Indian society. For example, in a second chapter, From Trade to Territory, we discussed that at the early phase of English East India Company, which came to India around as in 17th century to set up as the trade relations, their trading towns in India. At their early phase, they set up as their trading points, trading centers. Afterwards, when they interfere in political matters of Indians, it visualized too as the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and Battle of Buxar of 1764. In which the Britishers first battle, in Battle of Plassey, in which Britishers they supported those Indians against of the Siraj-ud-Daulah to removing him from his post of a Nawab of a Bengal, afterwards as against of Mir Qasim, through which after the Battle of Buxar, Britishers getting as the political rights over a country. After the Battle of Plassey, nominal revenue rights given to the Britishers in a form of an incentive or a support in a Battle of Plassey. After the Battle of Buxar, Britishers, they became as the Devans of India, through which they responsible for a collection of a revenue from a Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. But after the death of the Mir Jafar in 1765, Britishers, they became as the Nabobs, the rulers of Bengal. Their political policies drastically as a change after the Battle of Buxar. Earlier, such Britishers which were known for the trading company, now they became as the rulers. So during as a 19th century, the growth of a nationalism, it was a reaction of exploitative British policies. The rise of a nationalism, it was as an increase among the Indians due to as the some of the factors which contributed to the rise of a Indian nationalism were oppressive nature of colonial expressions. The British conquest over the territories and take over the kingdoms under the various schemes. Britishers use as a subsidiary alliance, doctrine of lapse, subsidiary alliance, doctrine of lapse, military confrontations to which they they occupying the Indian territories under the British control. Second, introduction of a new laws and administrative institutions. Britishers set up the newer laws like as a the chapter we discussed as the since 1870 towards the 1870 to the 1880s, Britishers they enacted the three important law through which they restricted as a freedom of Indians, in which the important as a Vernacular Press Act. Vernacular Press Act, which restricted as a freedom of a press through which they can't publish such news which indicates as the negative aspect of a British Empire. So Vernacular Press Act of 1878 restricted as a freedom of a press and communication facilities. Third, the changes in the lives of the peasants and tribals due to as an enactment of the forest law which restricted the movement of a tribals in a forest lands. Movement of very good Japji Arms Act and Ilbert Bill. So due to as the introduction of the forest law, it restricted the movement of a tribals in a forest lands. Those tribals earlier which were completely dependent upon a forest for obtaining as their residence or goods which they desired in their day-to-day life. Even the agriculture practices practiced in a forest lands in a form of a shifting cultivation. Such kind of a tribal activities restricted by the Britishers by enactment of forest law. The lives of a peasants, it drastically has a change with the introduction of a newer revenue systems, which we discuss in a third chapter, ruling countryside. In third chapter, we discuss the three important revenue systems introduced during as British age: Mahalwadi system, Rayatwadi system, and Zamindari system. Such land revenue systems initiated by the Britishers to increase the income of a company. These revenue systems were separately imposed in a different parts of a country, as through which they can maximize the use of the Indian resources, through which they can earn as a more profit. Such extra profit they use for a completion of their other needs. For example, earlier, at the early phase of a British Empire, they started to brought the money directly from England towards India for purchasing of a raw material, maintenance of an army, and in administration. But due to as a introduction of a new revenue systems, now they are capable to complete their all expenses within a country. So the such newer revenue systems, they positively supported towards as a British Empire, and negative impacts visualized on a Indian society. Those peasants which were unable to pay the revenue on time, their lands were acquired by the company officials. Land acquired. So those farmers which were earlier as a land owners, they became as a tenants during as a British age. Due to as a this act of a Britishers, a large section of a population want to change the political structure, through which they started as the agitation. Such agitations we learned in a fourth chapter of our history in a form of a Birsa Munda, tribal leader who worked against of the introduction of a Christianity and the changes in a tribal society. The restrictions imposed by Britishers in a tribal society because of which the tribals took as they started as an agitation against our British Empire and its policies. In fifth chapter, we discuss regarding as the revolt of 1857, rebel of 1857, their causes, in which the people, why do as a people as started as a revolt against our Britishers because of the injustice happened with the some sections of a society. Then in sixth chapter, we discuss as the educational policies, British educational policies, in which Britishers introduced, they upgraded, they increased the use of English in Indian subcontinent. The idea behind the introduction of English in India, it was as the use of Indians in administration. Use of Indians in administration. With introduction of English in a school education and promotion of Christianity, it was as an attack over Indian culture and the traditions and the regional languages. So those people which promoted as those Orientalists which promoted as the Indian culture, they consider this act of Britishers as a bad for the Indian society. In next chapter, seventh chapter, we discuss as the social reforms, social and the caste reforms done by the Britishers. In relation to the social reforms, Britishers enacted a new law in Indian society through which they modified those traditions, those earlier customs which were associated with which considered as the social evils related with the women, like as a polygamy. It was as restricted by the Britishers. Britishers promoted as the girl education. It was as a good for the Indian society, but those orthodox which consider that the changes takes place by the Britishers as the direct attack over their society, their culture, their trades and traditions. Ban on a sati system. Britishers, they legalized that the widow remarriages in India. In caste reforms, in this form, as the Britishers, they followed as a uniform system in a military. Irrespective of the persons belong from any of a caste, all the caste, people belong from the different castes, they were hired in a British army, which considered as a wrong by some of the Indians. Social and religious reforms takes place by the Britishers. The revolt of 1857 and its consequences. When we see as a chapter number 5 of a history, in which as indicates the causes responsible for the revolt of 1857, we discuss as a political causes, religious causes, socio-economic causes, military causes, and immediate causes. So all such causes which leads to the outbreak of a revolt of 1857. 1857. After the end of 1857, the successful suppression of revolutionaries in India in 1858, the consequences were visualized. Britishers, they started to change their policies. Earlier, which were as the openly opposed as the Indian culture traditions, now they started as to follow as a divided rule policy, which leads to the communal rights in India. Such communal rights which visualized in the age of 1945, 1946, and 47, in the form of a Hindu-Muslim rights. Due to the British policies, the economic policies, chapter number 8, we discuss as the growth of industries in England, how they adversely impact over the craftsmen, the local traditional industries of India. Due to the growth of cotton textiles in England, they exported a large number of cotton, raw cotton directly towards England, and afterwards they purchased the raw cotton at a cheaper rates, low cost from India towards England, and afterwards high rates of a cotton clothes sold in Indian markets. Indian markets. They forced the farmers to produce as an indigo, which was as high demanded in a European countries. High demanded in European countries. We discussed regarding as a commercialization of agriculture, in which Britishers introduced the cash crops in India to increase their profit margin. Due to as a introduction of a commercialization, cash crops were high demanded in China and European countries, like as indigo in European countries and opium in China. Opium tea in China. Chinese silk, it was as exchange with the opium and tea produced in Indian subcontinent, because of which as Britishers they introduced as a commercialization. And that commercialization of agriculture adversely impact over such Indian economy where the farmers, they owned the smaller agricultural fields. Due to as a small agriculture fields, farmers, they emphasize over the subsistence agriculture, preference to the food crops, neither to the cash crops. But Britishers, they force Indians for a production of a cash crops. When the production of indigo, it leads as a decrease the quality of a soil, the land, they became as the barrens. It was also adversely impact visualized on an Indian society, especially in a peasants. Due to as an introduction of a postal services, postal system, common currency, railways, telegraph system, which help to link the different parts of a country together, through which Britishers they can easily transmit the information among the different parts of a country, which help them in a administration and suppress as a revolutionary activities in a different parts of country. Britishers, they opted as a racial discrimination in administration. They given as a higher post to the British officials, the company officials, neither to the Indians. For example, in a military, the highest post given to the Indian, it was as a Subedar. Indians were not allotted with the higher military ranks in a British army. In British army, next is a lack of the popular support for legislations of social reforms. At this time of a British age, legislations, a law were enacted, but as a relation to the social changes, there were not as a sufficient number of the law enacted by the Britishers, which was as one of the reasons responsible for the injustice increase among the Indians. Introduction of English language as a medium of a communication for people throughout the country, it also increased as a injustice among other Indians. At this time of independence, during as a colonial rule, a large number of writers, they write regarding as a nationalism, right? For example, when we are seeing as a writings of the Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Deen Bandhu Mitra, Rabindranath Tagore, which instilled among the common people a feeling of a pride in and respect for their own past. Clear? So afterwards, after 1858, when Britishers successfully suppressed the revolutionary activities throughout the country, they started to change as their policies. Earlier, those policies framed by the Britishers in concern of our Indians, now they started as to change their policies to just suppress the Indian society, in which they introduced a newer revenue systems. Under age of the 1870s to the 1880s, Japji, very good. She is given as a three of the acts were enacted: Arms Act, Albert Bill, and the Vernacular Press Act. These three acts passed by the British further exposed the racial and discriminatory nature of the colonial state. The Arms Act of 1878, passed during as the time period of a Lord Lytton, which prohibited the Indians from possessing the firearms without licenses. The second controversial law enacted during the British age, it was a Vernacular Press Act 1878. Vernacular Press Act of 1878, which allowed the government to confiscate newspapers if they published anything objectionable against of British Empire, British policy. If any means of a communication through which, if anybody published such news which indicates that the British Empire, their policies, their dignitaries, their officials are doing wrong in a country, under such circumstances, Britishers, they cancelled their license. Not insimilar to the present scenario. In present society, where all the newspapers, means of communication are free to publish as the news, even against of the government also. But during as the age of Britishers, during colonial rule, means of communication directly controlled by the Britishers in their hand. Afterwards, as the Ilbert Bill in 1883 enacted by the Britishers, in which this Ilbert Bill passed during as a time of Lord Ripon, which allowed the judges of Indian origin to try Europeans in India. The Europeans in India reacted harshly. Ultimately, the government amended the bill and changed as the provision in which earlier those Indian judges which can take which can cross-examine or give as the verdict on a British officials' cases, that tradition was changed afterwards. Clear? Till there any questions? Till there any questions? During a colonial rule, the literate society, it was divided among the two groups. One was known as Anglics. Anglics were those which were promoted the Western education, Western culture, Western traditions. They opposed as Indian and Asian culture and their art forms. The second group was the Orientalists. Orientalists were those number of the foreigners and Indians which promoted as a Indian culture, Indian languages, tradition, education system. But one group was also there which were known as a linguists. Linguists were preferably those people were known which were known for which were familiar or having as a knowledge about the different languages. Different Asian, European, Western, Eastern countries, their languages spoken by the people, they were known as the linguists. Clear? So after the age of 1880s, now Britishers, they decided to make Indians to be as busy in a politics, for which as Britishers finally decided to framed as the INC. Formation of a INC, Indian National Congress. Indian National Congress, it was as a promoted as the interests of the Indian people through as the various political associations and meetings. In 1883, the S.N. Banerjee, 1883, S.N. Banerjee started the All India National Conference. All India National Conference at Calcutta in order to involve a larger number of people and put forward the demands of the people of India. So due to as efforts of A.O. Hume, efforts of A.O. Hume, a retired British civil servant, and some important Indian leaders like Dadabhai Naroji, Firoz Shah Mehta, Badruddin Tayyabji, W.C. Banerjee, Surendranath Banerjee, Romesh Chandra Dutt, S. Subramania Iyer, due to as their efforts, the INC founded in Bombay in 1885, Indian National Congress, founded in 1885 by the A.O. Hume. A.O. Hume founded the Indian National Congress in Bombay in 1885. The first session of the Congress, it was held at Bombay under leadership of her W.C. Banerjee. W.C. Banerjee, the 72 delegates from throughout the country, from all over the country, attended as the Congress session, and the Indian National Congress played a stellar role, the important role in articulating the nationalist demands in front of Britishers. The idea behind the formation of INC was that the basic idea behind the formation of Indian National Congress, it was that Britishers want a platform through which as some dignitaries they present the problems associated with the British administration, and through the such dignitaries they try to control over the Indians. Such revolutionary activities which were not easily controlled by the Britishers earlier, now as through their efforts through the formation of an Indian National Congress, it's easy for them. Now it's easy for them through which they can know about the problems associated with the Indians. Delegates means dignitaries, such high profile people which were popularized among the people, popularized among the Indians. Delegates, these were the representatives which were belonged from the such individuals which were belonged from the various sections of society. They indirectly we can say as a these were the representatives of a society, through which as Britishers they can easily control, they can check upon the Indians. For which as the Indian National Congress founded by the Britishers in 1885 at Bombay. 1885 at Bombay. Clear? Till there, any questions? Any questions? At the early phase, yes. At the early phase of the formation of a Congress, all the members of a Congress, these were favored the Britishers, their rule over India. Britishers ruled over India. They thought that only the Britishers, their ideologies, it can be as sufficient for the promotion of a country, for a growth of a country. So in the beginning of the Congress, it was as dominated by a group of the leaders called as the moderates. They believed that the British respected the ideals of freedom and justice and would accept the just demands of Indians. They sought gradual reforms and not independence from British rule. They wanted the British to train Indians in the art of self-government. To voice their demands, they adopted peaceful and constitutional methods It was as ideology of the method, ideologies of a moderates rather. Ideologies of a moderates. Ideologies of a moderates in which they thought that they wanted that the British to train Indians in the art of a self-government. To voice their demands, they adopted the peaceful and constitutional methods and pressed for changes through petitions. To file as a petitions in front of the British administration, in front of the British Parliament, which was framed after the 1857. 1857. Afterwards, the 1857, there was as the British Parliament, their rule directly imposed over India. Rule imposed over India. Before of Britishers, there were the large number of trading companies were there, which were known for the set up the trade relations with India. But during as the British age, British political power, when Britishers came into as a political power, they became as a monopoly rights over a country. They completely dominating over a country. Completely dominating over a country. Moderates tried to mobilize the public opinion through the speeches and writings critical of a British economic policies. So when the Congress leaders, such Congress leaders which consider that the British acts, the acts of Britishers are against of the acts of Britishers against of the will of the Indians, such section of a Congress later in history named as the extremists or radicals. Clear? So this much for today. We will continue on tomorrow. Any questions? Those who want to ask a question, click to your cameras. Click your cameras. Before of the formation of the Congress, mostly as Indians, they were revolutionarized common people. They showed their aggression against of the authority because nobody as a controlling them. The earlier want to give as a some political freedom to the Indians, but in later stage, the mid of the 20th century, that opportunity of a political representativeness, it was given as an opportunity for Indians through which they increase as the pace of the freedom in our country, which visualized in a form of a freedom of a nation in 1947.